Thanks, you guys. Welcome back to one of our webinar training series. We are so excited to have you tonight. It's one of our most pressing questions that have so many answers. I think it's one of the topics that has the most information, which makes it even more confusing. So we want to get you the answers. If we haven't met, I'm Karen Mayer Cunningham, special education boss, training everyone that sits at the 504 IEP table to navigate and negotiate successful student outcomes. We are so excited to have our special guest, Dr. Mitch Yell, who is very famous. If you have not gotten any of his books or his materials, they're available in our Amazon link. And he is an amazing author, a speaker, a trainer, a hearing officer in South Carolina. And Dr. Yell, thank you so much for coming tonight.
Thanks for asking.
Yeah, so we're going to be training tonight on writing measurable, meaningful IEP goals. And we're just sort of doing an interview process. Obviously, Dr. Yell is the expert in this space. I know as a parent advocate, I read IEP goals all the time. And I think sometimes it's kind of easy for us to tell what's a terrible IEP goal, but what is a good IEP goal. And so, Dr. Yell, I'm just going to start out with kind of tell us a little bit about what you do in the special ed space and how people could contact you.
Okay, well, I'm a professor at the University of South Carolina. I've been here for 30 years. Actually, I came from Minnesota, where I see a couple people are here from Minnesota, where they're evidently having a heat wave. Came here with a intention of staying for a couple of years, and that was 30 years ago. I just got my 30-year pin, so I really enjoyed here, especially enjoy the winters because they're not very long and there's very little snow once in a while. My primary, when I did come here, my primary area was training teachers in emotional and behavioral disorders. And I started writing actually my first book on special education law when I came here. And since I've been doing a lot of that, writing on legal issues, presenting on legal issues. Also, I am a hearing officer in South Carolina. I'm what's called a second-tier hearing officer. We are one of 7 states that there's a first-tier hearing, which is usually held by the state, but in South Carolina, it's held in the school district. And then if there's an appeal, instead of going to a court, which is what happens in Texas, is it goes to second tier, which that is what I do. So I just sit in the dining room table in front of my computer and get all the transcripts and read the exhibits, and usually about 1,000 pages of transcripts and 80 or so exhibits, always IEPs, prior written notice, often progress monitoring when they're done will be part of that. And also I've lately become an expert for the Department of Justice on ADA discrimination cases. I've done a couple of those, very interesting, very different from the, as you know, Karen, very different from the due process hearing.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. So if for all of you take a screenshot of this, this is a requirement for everybody that I train in my 2-day trainings. This is Dr. Yell's Law and Special Education book. You can find it online. We also have it in our link, but you need this. This is critical to really, it's so detailed. It sort of tells you where we came from here, how we got here. It really lines out expectations in the special education and IEP process. So make sure that you get that. That is available in the link. I'm sure somebody will put it in the link, or you could just email us advocate@ Special Education Academy, and we can get you the information. You need this book. I think your the 6th edition is coming out soon. Is that right, Dr. Yell?
I'm writing it right now.
Okay, I hope I get my picture in there. Who you don't want a TikTok from, the Karen Cunningham section. So, Dr. Yell, I just had a hearing, and I thought there were some interesting questions in the hearing that I just had. And, due process can be a little bit overwhelming. But really, when we look at filings, whether they're a state complaint or an OCR, any of those, there are just really very few pieces that we file on. And really, the thing that we are supposed to write to teach a child strategies to self-manage their disability is this IEP goal. So I want to talk about an acronym that I can't stand. And you know what I'm going to say? That it's a SMART goal. I don't know if anybody even knows what that means, but it's specific, measurable, attainable, realistic timeline. Is that a framework that you teach? Because I know that we have a million educators on here and we love educators. Do you teach that to school districts? Do you find that appropriate? Do you find it understandable? Is it antiquated? Or do you use another model to teach?
I don't actually teach that. I mean, you hear it a lot, and of course, that comes from the business world anyway. I think it's more, I tend to teach a method of writing goals that was developed way back in 1963 by a man named Robert Mager, who was an efficiency expert in the U.S. Air Force. And he developed a method for writing goals for other like motor pools and things like that in the Air Force. And someone told me, this would be a good thing to do for educators. So when he got out of the Air Force, he wrote a book called Preparing Instructional Objectives. It was one of the books my advisor used in my undergraduate training. Of course, nobody had really had special ed on the mind, and he certainly didn't. But it was a perfect way to write a goal that was measurable,
Okay.
and that's what I use. And
Okay.
he developed a three-step method.
Okay. And can you tell us about your steps? Or can that be done in, an hour?
About what?
Can you tell us about the steps that you use to write a goal?
Absolutely. Well, actually, his method is for actually writing the goal. And as you know, Karen, um, most goals aren't measurable. And he said they have to be measurable. And of course, that's what the law says. They have to be measurable. And what Mager did is he said there's three steps. And the first step is you have to have a target behavior. That target behavior has to be what he called a visible target behavior. It has to be something you can count, you can see happening, it's verifiable, as opposed to invisible target behaviors. And too often, I think, in education, that's what we see is we see a lot of these kind of invisible target behaviors, where they'll, for instance, have things like enjoy, to understand, to improve, to develop, things like that. And you can't really measure those because they're really invisible. They're open to too many interpretations. So what he said is number one, target behavior, observable, measurable, verifiable, repeatable, like to write, to read aloud, to point to, things like that, something you can see. The second thing he said you have to have is what Barbara Bateman a number of years called a given, and he called it a condition. And that is how you're going to measure. Are you going to, what's the context? What are the materials? What's the environment? Um, so if you're, say, giving oral reading fluency, have an oral reading fluency goal, you'd say uh, when given a basal reader at the fifth grade level, or a reading passage at the fourth grade level, or if it's a writing goal, when given a story starter, 3 minutes to write, that would be your given. That's the second part. Said you have to have that. The third part is your criterion for acceptable performance. That is, when will you know the goal has been achieved? And that can be accuracy, it can be speed, it can be fluency, but it can't be opinion. It can't be, well, I think Johnny's a better reader. It has to be Johnny read so many words per minute, and you can compare that to what his baseline was. And so the criterion for acceptable performance that's your tool for measurement. So target behavior, condition or given, criterion for acceptable performance. Then in many states, like in my state of South Carolina, we have to add a timeline to that. That's when the goal is to be achieved. So that's just an extra add-on to Mager's. And that's not the way to write a goal. It's a way to write a goal. And as you know, Karen, and I've looked at probably thousands of IEPs, and I could count measurable goals on one hand. There just aren't a
If
lot of.
that, yeah.
Yeah, and and it's not, and I was a teacher for 16 years, and believe me, teachers don't want to write goals that aren't measurable. They don't know how in many cases. And it's a really easy process if you just kind of go back to what Mager talked about in 1963. And literally everyone who has written on writing goals since then uses his method.
Okay. So can we talk about, one of the things that we hear and our team hears, and people will, die on this rock, is it has to be a state standard. And I just call that complete shenanigans. I get IEPs, and I understand that we have sort of the gift of the software, which I think I miss the good old days, Mitch, when we had Miss Betty writing in triplicate. Remember that?
Oh, yeah.
IEP paperwork. And I think sometimes the information in the special ed software, whatever you're using, actually might cripple the multidisciplinary team that's writing the IEP goal. So obviously it's been taught to them in a professional development. You can't all be saying it from Miami to Minnesota without somebody telling them that it has to be a state standard. Well, if it's a state standard, then it wouldn't be an IEP goal. So can you talk to that and possibly that training that goes out to teachers or administrators?
Yes, well, I think that, and that's often the case. I've seen too that they just put the state standards in as goals. That's not the purpose of goals. Really, the goal is related to the child's present levels of need, and it's what you expect them to achieve in 1 year. Now, I mean, you can use the state standards to inform the goal, but you have to consider that children need the skills to access a goal or access a state standard. And if they don't have those access skills, writing a state standard will be meaningless for them. They have to be able to access that standard.
And is there anywhere in IDEA, I know we have imaginary state standards, is there anywhere in IDEA that says an IEP goal must be aligned to a state standard?
No, not really. What it says is that the child has to have an IEP that essentially allows them to be involved in the general education curriculum, which at one point in the IEP, in the IDEA, excuse me, it says the general curriculum is a curriculum and all students must learn. But our students, our kiddos are there because they're failing to learn. And so we have to teach them in ways that they can. So that means sometimes writing goals that allow them to access the standards. I mean, they can't, a child can't identify the main idea in a paragraph if they can't read. So you have to teach them to read first.
Right, that's so good. One of the things that I hear so often is, and I can't remember the fancy word that you use, but immeasurable, invisible words: improve, excel, increase, decrease. I like that he will decrease his outbursts when upset. How would you know that he might have decreased his outburst 75 times? And so
Yeah.
some of the goals are really about what I call in my training, you're talking about the finish line. They're not connected to the baseline. And how did you get there? There's 100 ways for you to drive from your house to my house. And so I think one of the things that we do is that we write, I will have people say, well, we can't just put increase. And I will have a school-based member say, well, I don't want to lock him into something. So as a hearing officer, I kind of just the opposite. I want to make sure that what you're working on, what Alicia's working on, we've locked into a target. Would that be fair?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. And so what would you say back to somebody that said, well, I just want to put increase so I don't lock him into something?
Well, the problem, of course, there is how can you measure it? I mean, if you don't have something you're aiming at, which is what the goal does, it says where the child is going to be in 1 year's time. If you just say increase, I mean, how do you measure if a child is making progress? I mean, you can increase from oral, say, let's take oral reading fluency. You can increase in 1 year from 21 words per minute to 22. Well, that's an increase, but it's really not an appropriate increase.
Right.
So you have to, like you said, you have to really have your target.
Okay. And so when we talk about the target, what I call the finish line, after we deliver direct and explicit instruction, where does, if there wasn't software and it was, first year teacher, where does she get the baseline from for an IEP goal?
Well, and that's a great question. One of the problems with getting the baseline is very important. And, we have to have according to the regulations, there have to be certain things in the baseline. You have to identify the student's need. You have to say what the effect on the general curriculum is. And although no court has ever said this, it really should serve as a baseline, because how can we possibly show progress if we don't know where the child has begun or where they've started? We can measure from that. That's why a baseline is so important, because it helps us to really prioritize our goals. And it's very important that we understand that when we write a present level statement, a lot goes into that, and it'll essentially put us on the path to measuring a student's progress.
Right. And so when one of the things that I get almost every day, and people say it to me in person, which is comical. We can't, which I think is funny, because IDEA actually gave us great liberty, even starting out in Child's Find, right, about identification. It actually lets us can. And so one of the things that I hear a lot about IEP goals is I can't give him a reading goal because he doesn't have an identified reading disability. Or I can't give him a behavior goal because he doesn't have a behavior disability. So can you speak to that? What are annual IEP goals? Where do we get them from?
Well, we get them essentially from the assessment. You have to have a good, thorough assessment that addresses all of a child's needs. And I've heard that too. Yeah, maybe this child has problem behavior, but that's not his area of disability. Therefore, you don't address. Absolutely incorrect. The law is real clear. You have to address all of a child's needs. Courts aren't all that concerned about what category it is. They're more concerned about what the needs of a child are. So don't make the mistake of thinking we don't have to do this. We don't have to do an assessment or a goal in this area, because that's not the child's disability. You have to address all of the child's needs with a thorough and complete assessment. And then you take that and the needs you develop in the assessment that go into the IEP as the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance.
Perfect. When when I am in meetings with wonderful professionals, we usually have sort of what I call the standard handful, right? We have a reading goal, I throw in a math goal, and then the child has autism. So, one of the things I say in a meeting is we need to have at least one IEP goal attached to his areas of eligibility. The law says, based upon this eligibility, I'm in need of special education and related services. And I get so much pushback from that. I will literally have a child that has autism, ADHD, speech, and they have 2 dyslexia goals and a speech goal. And talk about the alignment of, that's the reason we identified them with an eligibility. It needs to be at least tied somewhat to the eligibility, correct?
Absolutely. In fact, and I always like to, when I train, I like to talk about an IEP being internally consistent. That means the needs you've identified in the assessment stage go into the present levels of performance. From those, you have to have a service, a special ed service, a related service, a supplementary service, program modification to address every one of those needs. Now, it might not require a goal. Let's say if the child had a visual impairment and needed large print books, well, you wouldn't write a goal on having large print books. So you wouldn't necessarily have to have a goal, but you have to have a service that meets every need. Actually, it's kind of interesting. The first due process review I did was over 10 years ago now. That was the IEP had gone to the second tier level, which is me reviewing, and the hearing officer had sided with the school district because they essentially not made any procedural errors. First thing I did was took out the IEPs, and I found out, well, There's a need for math. There's a need for they had listed her present levels of performance needs in math, reading, communication, and behavior. Well, so I looked at the rest of the IEP, and here I found they had reading, math, communication, reading, communication, and behavior goals, but no math. Well, that maybe is not a problem as long as there's a service that addresses the math. When I got to the service section, a couple reading things, behavior, communication, no math. That was an internally consistent IEP because it said, here's our need, and they didn't address it anywhere else. So I overturned the hearing officer's decision because of that internal inconsistency. Very important. I think that all our teachers and parents do understand the concept of internal consistency of an IEP.
One of the things that I'll hear is when I address that, and so my position is if there's a service, we're probably going to be also attached to an IEP goal. That way we measure if the service is making progress. But either way,
Yeah.
six one way, half a dozen the other. And I will hear an accommodation, especially design instruction. I'm like, that's really weird because it's called an accommodation. And while I get the wordsmithing, because those of us have been given the gift of persuasion, hopefully we're always using that for good. Is an accommodation part of SDI? Yes, but in isolation, an accommodation is not specially designed instruction. Is that accurate?
That's very accurate. Yeah, specially designed instruction is not just an accommodation, but it's a different type of instruction that's directed toward meeting the unique needs of the child.
Right.
And so an accommodation may be part of it, as you said, but is not SDI.
Yeah, and I hear that all day long. And I think the thing that grieves me the most, and I'm surely you, is it sounds right in the meeting. It really does. And so what I find for kiddos that probably need IEP goals, they probably need measurable goals, is we have 42 accommodations. And I know that if we got rid of all those accommodations and started providing specially designed instruction that we measured IEP goal, we wouldn't need all those accommodations. Do you see that when you're doing hearings?
Yeah, most of the time, I think a problem that I often see is that they have so many accommodations, like 42 you're saying, that there's just no way they're going to be implemented. And then you have an implementation problem.
Right. So how when you're talking about an IEP goal, so we have a training. IEP goals can be in communication, they can be in language, they can be in a related service, academic. What is the difference in the acronym PLAF? What's the difference? And of course, Andrew F. teases it out. The academic achievement, right? That's academics, those four core. What is functional performance? What are functional performance goals?
Yeah, that's very good. The courts have essentially and the U.S. Department of Education have really defined the functional. They haven't been real specific, but what they said is essentially anything that's not academics. It's communication, socialization, behavior. It's often linked with behavior.
Okay.
But it is non-academic goal. Now, another thing I'll hear, and you might hear too, is we have to have both. You design the IEP based on the unique needs of the child. So if there are functional needs, you address them.
Right. But we don't have to have both, right? I mean, I have tons of
No.
kiddos that are ADHD, and we would like them to sit in their desk once in a while, but they are the valedictorian, right? So it's about specificity. What is the child's
Yep,
need? It's literally what it
absolutely.
says in Andrew F. Can you talk a little bit about, and I do love Andrew F. And we'll have you back to talk about that, but just a little bit about when the court heard Andrew F. in March of 2017, did they talk about Andrew's IEP goals?
Yes. Well, first thing to understand, I guess, is the Supreme Court. That was a case out of the Supreme Court, and the parents were undaunted because they had lost it. They had lost at due process. They lost at federal district court. They lost at U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit, and then did what's called a petition for certiorari to the United States Supreme Court, and to the surprise of many, it decided to hear the case. And one of the things the Supreme Court does is they don't look at all the issues of a case. They will look at one or two issues. And they looked at how do we define educational benefit? And they said, well, the 10th Circuit had held educational benefit is merely more than de minimis. It's a little more than nothing is enough. And the court said, no, the purpose of the IEP is academic and functional advancement. And so what they did is they overturned the 10th Circuit decision and remanded the case, or said, now here's your law is bad. Your decision on de minimis education is no longer good law. Now you have to use the Andrews standard. And so the 10th Circuit kicked it back to the district court, and they overturned it by looking at Andrews' IEP, specifically at the behavioral goals he had. And they had said that those goals were not sufficiently ambitious to enable him to make progress.
Right. So let's talk about, and I know that we did it with Andrew, and I find that 99.99% of people in schools are integrous, good-hearted. I mean, anybody that'll take your kids all day, they just walk on water. And I hear, and I sit in meetings that we're going to continue this. We're just going to continue the goal, continue the goal. So can you talk about why that's a good idea or not a good idea?
Well, it's not a good idea in that if you, I mean, may as well put a red dot on your IEP saying does not meet FAPE. Because if you're doing the same thing year after year, something is not working. And that's exactly what happened in Andrew's case, is that he had IEPs carried over from second grade to third grade to fourth grade. And when it went back to the district court level, that's one of the things they noted. In fact, all the courts noted that his education wasn't particularly good, but because they said our standard is merely more than little more than nothing, that was okay by them. But yeah, it's very important. I think that's not a good idea. And now if you have a goal and it's not being met, well, that means there's probably something wrong in your present levels, in your assessment, in your goals, and the services you're offering. So just to carry it over and over may not be a problem, but it's going to indicate there could be a problem there.
So one of the things that I do when I train people is that I look at two things: rate of progress and expectancy, right? So if it took Billy 10 years to read at level H, I want to try to measure my data where I'm going in alignment with his rate of progress. Not what I want, not what Pennsylvania says, not what Colorado wants. Because I think it's really important in special education that we're transparent. We don't close gaps. And I know that hurts some people's feelings. I think our job is to make sure the gap doesn't get smaller and to teach them strategies. But when a teacher, Mr. Smith or Miss Jones, is looking to write an IEP goal and they have this baseline, they've got good data, how would they know? I mean, are they just spitballing it? How will they know what he can increase in a goal? How do they know that?
That's a really interesting question. Well, for academics, it's really not difficult. I mean, you can go on to websites like Intervention Central and Easy CBM, and they will have databases that you can use in determining goals. Another thing a teacher can do is they can look at other students who are doing well, see where they are, and base the goal on that. So there's a lot of things you can base them on. But the thing we want to base them on most frequently is increases that allow them to make the kind of progress that we need in order that they may return to the mainstream, which may not be or into the regular classroom, which may not be a realistic option, but it should be something we're aiming at.
Right. So when we're looking at, and I appreciate that. So when we're looking at the IEP goal, and Danette's the most amazing teacher and she's working with Billy and he's just not making progress. Other than changing, and of course I'm going to rabbit trail into another topic, which we'll have you train on later. I always say we need to make an adjustment. A lot of times they'll say, well, he's not focused, he's not bringing his best, which makes me nuts. When he tries, which makes me nuts. So if we've implemented the goal with fidelity and he's not making expected gains, do we change the goal, or do we look at changing where we deliver the goal, or the kind of educator that works on the goal?
Well, that's a really good question. I was my advisor was a man named Stan Dino when at the University of Minnesota. And one of the things Stan always said is, if a child is not meeting the goal, change instruction. And that's the whole reason for progress monitoring. If a child is making growth in your progress, and you're measuring that progress, that's great. If they're not, you need to change something in instruction. You don't say, oh, that goal must be too ambitious, we're going to lessen it. That's absolutely the wrong thing to do. We need to change instruction in those cases. And remember too, Andrew was always talking, Andrew and the lower court decisions talked about reasonably ambitious goals. That goals should be ambitious enough that if child meets them, that will confer progress, or they will make progress. We had a case actually that went all the way to the Supreme Court from South Carolina's case that was heard on a different matter. It was Carter v. Florence. When it was heard in South Carolina, it was a FAPE case at the district court level because the school, in the federal district court judge's mind, had written goals that he said rendered the IEP inadequate at inception, because it didn't, even if the child would meet those goals, they essentially would be losing ground.
That's so good. So good. So let's say, and I know that the next training that you're doing is on progress monitoring, which I know will really break the internet, because we don't teach our staff members how to do that well. But then is there a duty or an obligation for the school-based members to say, this isn't working? So, as I sit in IEP meetings, some districts have trimesters, but most of them we're either looking at progress every 6 weeks, junior high school, or every 9 weeks. Do you just let it roll for 18, 27 weeks? What would be the obligation? And you were a special ed teacher. When do we say, I need to have a meeting and talk about adjustment of something?
Well, that's an important point. That parents can request an IEP at any time. If they're getting progress data that show a child is not making any progress, or they're getting progress reports that are just very subjective, and they're unsure if, the parent can call an IEP meeting. The teacher could call an IEP meeting, or if the teacher finds that a child is not making the kind of progress they're expecting, they could just call the parent, and they don't have to have the entire meeting over again. Call the parent, get them in, show them what you're doing, make some instructional changes, then inform the IEP team. So I think it's really important. Now, one of the things that I always did as a teacher is took a lot of data, because one of the things we know is the more data you take, the more sensitive that data is, and the more quickly you can make a change.
Right. That's so good. That was, yeah. One of the things that was in question this week at the hearing, which I can talk about now because hearing's over, is it was unique that the hearing officer, asked, and I think it's very subjective, but pretty clean. When I train people, I'm like, it's got to be you need to put it in 3 places: the IEP, the evaluation, or the IEP progress report. And so, how important is the IEP progress report when you're measuring those goals that you wrote?
Well, it's very important, because that's the way you can show progress, and that's what Andrew F. said. We have to develop an IEP that's reasonably calculated to enable the child to make progress in light of their circumstances. Now, if we don't have measurable goals, You can't measure them. We can't show any progress. One of the things I see a lot in hearings lately is parents are asking, one of the problems in South Carolina is most of our due process hearings are pro se, which means the parents represent themselves because we don't have any good attorneys. And one of the things I'm noticing, and parents are pretty good about this, they're saying, I'm not getting any progress reports. And when I get them, they don't mean anything. And so again, as a longtime teacher, I'd say it's not that teachers don't want to measure progress. It's oftentimes they really don't know how. I mean, progress actually is pretty easy to measure if you have a measurable goal. And the best way to and I always say to teachers that remember this, progress data or your data are not words, they're numbers, that you need to be collecting data in terms of numbers. And numbers are very easy to graph. If you can't graph from the present levels to where you want the child to be, if you can't graph that, you don't have a measurable goal. And there's nothing that's more intuitively understandable than a graph.
Right.
And that's the best way to monitor progress.
Right. That's
And
interesting that you said that every
you can also, by the way, say when, as you said, a child is not making progress, you can see it real clearly and say, oh, we need to make a change here. Let's get together and see what we can change instructionally in the child's program.
It's interesting that you said every time I see a graph now after working with you, I had a graph the other day and the students started at, they have NWE, I feel like they're basketball teams, MAPS, DRA, RAS kids, we have all these acronyms. And the student was at a 208 last year and she went like this and she ended the year at 208. And I'm not very smart, but I feel like that's the same number. And the school goes, we'll bring somebody in to explain it to you. No, it's the same number. 36 instructional weeks. And they brought in this person that explained the NWE to me like it was the surface of the moon. And they were like, do you have any more questions for our district lead? I said, so it was a 208 last year at our annual IEP meeting. She goes, correct. And I said, it's a 208 this year. She goes, correct. And I was like, I'm not, I was like, as a witness. I was like, I don't know, it's the same thing. So I would argue the same thing a year later is actually regression. Because nobody was meant to say the exact same. So when you see cases, when you see a goal that's immeasurable, what is like your legal response to that or your charge to committees or teams?
Well, essentially what I say is, especially when I'm working with parents, ask them to graph the goal for you. Graph the baseline and then graph where the goal is to be. And you want to see an increase. You want to see an increase, and then you collect data along the way to see if the child is going to be meeting the goal. One of the problems, and I think this is probably one of the things you were talking about, Karen, is people use tests that really aren't appropriate for measuring progress. Like you can't use a state or district-wide assessment because the whole purpose of those is they're measures of relative standing. They essentially say where a child is in comparison to normal peers. It's not an individual measurement. So you have to have measures that actually mean something. Yeah, I mean, I've seen schools use Woodcock-Johnson psychoeducationally. You give that once every 6 months. You can't measure growth that way. And there's so many easy ways to measure growth that are very simple, that don't take a lot of time, very efficient. And that's what should really be used.
Right. What do you think about, these are all my questions are trick questions. What do you think about present levels or IEP goals in comparison to other kids in the class with disabilities? I'm sure you've seen that.
Yeah, well, I think the problem is, of course, we have to show the individual student's progress. Are they making progress from the baseline, from their own baseline? It really, I mean, you can use comparisons with others as a means of assessing a child, but
Right.
in terms of progress monitoring, that is not the way to do it.
Right.
That doesn't really give, I mean, that's again, using a test inappropriately.
Right. I think you said the other day when we were talking, I said, I thought it was just such a great word that state tests are about comparison. And so comparison is not measuring progress. I thought that was great.
No.
So I know we have 4,000 million questions. We only have like 50 so far. So I'm going to go ahead and have Dr. Taylor open it up for questions. We are going to have Dr. Yell back, I think the 22nd or something like that next month. And we're going to talk about measuring data, all kinds of data, all kinds of ways, all kinds of days so that you guys can be effective at measuring accommodations, IEP goals, behavioral, a behavior intervention plan, all of those things with efficacy. So that is our next training with Dr. Yell. So Dr. Taylor, do you want to open it up for us for questions?
Yes, ma'am. The first question we have is, how do you write goals that are appropriately aligned with state academic content standards for a student who has severe autism and or significant intellectual disabilities? Students are taking end of course exams in history, algebra, and English, etc., and passing, yet they're not making progress on their IEP goals in over 2 years. The school is now changing the way they collect data on the IEPs using the same unmastered goals for the last 2 to 3 years, and they're just lowering the goal rate for mastery.
Well, I think there's probably no way to indicate that a FAPE is not being provided, no more effective way than just doing the same thing over and over again and lowering the goals because a child does not made any progress. That would indicate to me, and I think certainly to an investigator or say OCR or something, that there's something amiss here, that it's not appropriate. It's probably not an appropriate way to measure the goals. And if the goals are measurable in the first place, you know, how are you, if they're not measurable in the first place, it's kind of meaningless. I mean, you have to write measurable goals, and then you have to measure progress toward those goals and make instructional changes when a child is not making progress. And in your example, it's clear that child is not making progress, so it might be because the present levels are not appropriate or the assessment wasn't appropriate. It could be many different things, but it's not appropriate to say for a child who has not made the goals, well, we're just going to keep on working toward those end of course instruction. The I in IEP, of course, means individualized. The I in IDEA means individualized.
Okay. Where do you get alternative academic achievement standards, and are they appropriate to measure all students' goals?
Well, every state should have their alternate achievement standards, and that would be that's really a state issue. I mean, the federal government does say, you know, you can have so many on alternate standards, but actually measuring them, that would be a state issue, or how you get them would be something you'd have to look at your state for.
Okay. How do you make appropriate goals if the school is unable or does not seem to have the knowledge to write appropriate goals to enable a student to make progress?
Well, that's the $600,000 question. How can we get measurable goals, or indeed, how can we provide a FAPE when if teachers don't know how to write measurable goals, they don't know how to measure them. The problem really there is, as I've heard Karen say this a few times, it's a you problem. It's the school's problem. That is an education problem. And again, it's not that teachers don't want to measure goals, or they want to write measurable goals. It's often that they're not shown how to do it. And I would think it's a lot of times it's pre-service problems that I've seen kids come out of college that have no idea how to write a measurable goal or actually collect data. So that's a problem in their college or university. But also you have in-service in schools. You know, I remember when I was a teacher, we would have, a day at the beginning of the year on procedures, and oftentimes nothing at all on goal writing or on the substance of an IEP. And I think it's on us as college and universities to make certain our teachers are prepared. And it's also on the school district to ensure, and the state departments to ensure, that they are training teachers on a regular basis.
So Dr. Yell, I'm just gonna jump in, Dr. Taylor. Is there, I know that you work with lots of entities and serve. Can you talk about the Progress Center? Does that have information on IEP goal writing?
Yeah, there's actually two centers I would advise people look at. They are both national centers that's supported by the U.S. Department of Education. The first is called, as Karen said, the Progress Center. Just put Progress Center into Google and that'll be the first hit you get. That entire center is devoted to writing IEPs, to writing measurable goals. Then there is the National Center for Intensive Intervention. If you just put intensive intervention in Google, you'll get to that center. And they have a really good book, a pamphlet, I should say, on writing measurable annual goals. I mean, there's a lot of really good free stuff out there that the Office of Special Ed programs through the U.S. Department of Education funds. Your tax dollars at work, and there's some really good free resources available to teachers too on these very issues that we're talking about.
Okay. How do you know how many goals is too many goals, and when should modification happen if there are lots of goals?
Well, one of the things we need to understand about goals is if you have 100 goals, you've got to measure each one of them. So I would say, what are those most important needs that a child has for specially designed instruction? That's identified in the present level statement. You write goals based on those needs. Now, you don't have to have 50 different goals because you're not going to measure. Teachers will not, nobody's going to measure that many goals. So what you do is you pick out the most important goals. Now, with that, there are goals and progress monitoring and called general outcome measures. I mean, you could have 100 different goals on phonics and this and that and different types of phonics, but why not use a general outcome measure? I mean, there are measures we know that are effective to measure increases in reading. And one of the most commonly used measures of teachers of reading strength is oral reading fluency. You don't need to give much of a test to do that. You need to ask a child to read a list of words for 1 minute or to read aloud from a reading passage. And that gives you the data, and you have your numbers, and you can graph that. And that actually indicates a child's progress.
I just want to jump in because I'm a professional hijacker. I can tell you from the advocates that sit here, I literally am told in every meeting, and probably just been the last 2 or 3 years, we have stopped measuring fluency, which makes me insane. Because we know from Reading Rockets 1999 that fluency is literally the only bridge to comprehension. So how would you respond to that if you were in a meeting?
Well, I would say a couple things. One is reading fluency is what we could call a canary in the coal mine. When reading fluency, a child is reading fluency problems, they have overall reading problems.
Yes.
And I remember seeing a cartoon one time of a child in an optometrist office, and he was looking at the eye chart, the Snellen chart, and he was saying, well, I'm really concerned about my reading comprehension. Well, I mean, that kind of illustrates it. Reading fluency, we know this, is a measure of comprehension. I mean, when kids get better fluent or are better, more fluent readers, they're better comprehenders. The two are highly correlated. So, yeah, that would drive me crazy too. I would say, why are they doing that? That is the one measure of reading that's probably the most accurate overall of the outcome of reading. Why would you disallow that?
Right. And so one of the pieces of academia that we use is 90 years of oral reading fluency, which you can get on eric.ed.gov. It's amazing. And it's a real measurement. We know that we have a respectfully an illiterate nation. You have to know that USA Today is written on the 7th grade level, and a large percentage of adults just everywhere you go actually can't read that. So I think it's one of the missed things in an IEP, no matter what your disability is. I don't care if they're 3 or they're 22. I can get a running record, and I'm told this all the time. We don't do that in junior high. Actually, we do. We don't. It's legal. Because that is a measurement of all the things. I can be bad at math and I can get through, but my reading permeates everything. So it's a huge deal for us, and we always train on it. So, Dr. Taylor?
Many of my clients are struggling to get service logs from the schools. Can you speak to schools' responsibilities to provide this documentation, and what legal steps can we take if they're not collecting this information?
Okay, and I missed the first part. What you said, logs?
Service logs.
Service logs. Okay. Well, if there's any one thing that the Supreme Court, in every case they've ever done in special ed, they do like one every 4 years or so, if you look at it. They haven't done that many, but in every one of them, they've said parental participation is absolutely the most important thing of IDEA. The whole idea, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act really is, it not only encourages, but it demands that parents are meaningful participants in the process. I think one of the most important decisions, I think, under the Supreme Court decision was a decision a few years ago out in the Ninth Circuit, is called, in a case called MCV Antelope Hills. And essentially what they said is the IEP is like a contract. It's not like a contract, and schools are not bound to meet the goals, but it is a contract, in whatever you said you will do, you've agreed to do in the IEP meeting. That's the contract part. That's what you need to do. And one of the things in the IDEA, and if you read the statute or the regulations, it talks about regularly reporting a child's progress. Parents have the right to receive that. And in this case, I'll talk about MCV Antelope. One of the things they said is schools too often, this is the way I interpret it, schools too often make the mistake of, we involve the parent in the meeting, in the IEP meeting, then we're done. We don't have to do anymore. That's not what the Ninth Circuit Court said. They said the parent is involved throughout the process. The parent is also involved in the monitoring of an IEP. And if they're not getting the progress reports, they're not being involved in the progress, in the monitoring. So we have to give them regular progress reports. And I know we'll be talking about this later, but that's one of the things I notice in a lot of hearings now, is parents starting to ask for those, and schools don't often have them. That's a real problem.
And we'll have Dr. Taylor is one of our amazing partners. We'll get IEP progress reports, and it'll say in progress. Like, somebody typed that out.
Yeah.
Like that for all, like, we started in April 2023. Now we're in April, in progress, and last day mastered. I'm gonna need a little more to go on. And so,
Yeah.
and we'll talk about it in measuring, but I don't, I think we don't equip our amazing educators who are serving our kiddos. And a lot of times, I think you can see this, you've probably seen this in nature of hearings, you can tell intuitively the teacher is probably doing all the things, but she wasn't trained into, how do I capture proof of my, doing that, right? If you're a nurse, you have to chart what you did. That's part of their licensure. And we just throw these amazing teachers in there and they're loving kids and serving kids, but nobody taught them the basics, which we're going to talk about in our next training. But it's one of the reasons that teachers leave the profession, because
Oh,
we
yeah.
spend so much money on, I don't know what we're doing in professional development, but it's not that. So, Dr. Taylor.
I'm in resource and I feel like my oral reading fluency goals are all the same, except plugging in their current score and then end at a stretch goal. Will I be in trouble with them all being so similar?
No, because when you're putting in the child's baseline or where they are and where they're going to be, so that is individual. I mean, individualized. The reading goal itself, the oral reading fluency goal, is a way to measure. It's essentially, it's like, well, I went to a doctor because I have a problem with my knee. I had a problem with my knee the other day. What's the first thing that happens when you go to a doctor? They put you on the scale. They weigh you. They take your blood pressure. That had nothing to do with my knee, but what they're doing is they're taking measures of my physical health. They've established a baseline and they look at that, the blood pressure, the weight, is everything in order? That's essentially what we're doing in the present level. So we're taking measures of a child's educational health, and then we're monitoring them just like we do when we go to the doctor every 6 months or whatever. But it's not physical health, it's educational health. So I think it's perfect. Use oral reading fluency. You differ it in the individual nature of where the child starts, where the child ends. Now, one last thing I could say in South Carolina, and I think this is a very good thing, our IEPs have to include baseline and goal. So our IEP goals have to say, Johnny will, when given a story started in 1 minute to write a story, 1 minute to think about it, 3 minutes to write a story, Johnny will go from being able to write 24 words per minute in the baseline to 44 words a minute. And there you have, right in the goal, you have everything you need, your target behavior, your condition, and third, you have your criterion for acceptable performance. Now what you have to do is you just measure the child during the course of instruction. And if they don't look like they're going to make that goal, you change instruction.
And schools like that, they like for you to change instructions. They like to keep an eye on them. Is keeping an eye on somebody a measure?
Yeah.
Not a good.
What's the best practice for teachers who inherit immeasurable IEP goals and objectives?
Excellent question. Actually, the late Barbara Bateman wrote a book one time called From Gobbledygooks into Measurable Goals. And what she said is that, and you can do this, I mean, for the majority of goals that I see, I look at and I see, I know what the teacher was intending here, but they just didn't write it in a way that was actually measurable. And I think so what you need to do with those immeasurable goals is look at those three things. Look at the target behavior. Is there a target behavior? Is it visible? Look at the given or the condition, as Mager called it. Is there a way to measure it? And is there a criterion for acceptable performance? And fourth, we need a timeline. Try and change, see if you can rewrite the goal using Mager's methods or those three things I talked about at the beginning of the conference. You can take, or a session, you can take immeasurable goals and make them measurable. For most goals. Some of them just have to be thrown away and you have to start over again. But most goals can be made measurable.
How much does parental data count for information of goals? For example, a student of mine was evaluated for dysgraphia, but the school OT did not find her eligible. Meanwhile, I have samples from tutoring of the child's handwriting, and also she can't read her own writing, but the school would not add a goal for that because they didn't find her eligible. So how much weight does parental input have in goal creation?
Well, obviously the parent has to be meaningfully involved in the IEP process. Now, it could be that the parent would bring in some sort of evidence that the child was having problems in whatever area, and then you would discuss it in the IEP process. I'm sure Karen has done that many times. It's not that we parents, and I know I've sat on both sides of the IEP table because I have a child with a disability too. And, it's important that we discuss those things. Now, it could be that the IEP team will determine something that we didn't really want, but and that's acceptable, but we have to be able to have input. And if you have data to show, then it's up to the school district to say why that data is not meaningful.
I'd like to clarify my understanding. Did you say that not all functional needs require a goal?
Well, no, what I said is most needs will require a goal. Now, there's some needs, maybe a child has a need for some type of assistive technology, or a large print book I used as. You wouldn't necessarily need a goal about that, but you would need a service. So it is important to realize that when you have a need identified in the present levels, you have to have a service that addresses that. Now, if it's an academic or functional problem, that will usually also have a goal.
Okay.
But you have to have a service.
Dr. Yell mentioned something about a database for teachers. Is there a database that is recommended for parents to look for goals on their own or read through to get those ideas?
That's an excellent question. Actually, the Progress Center and the National Center on Intensive Intervention have some very good information. And the nice thing about the Progress Center is they break it down into these one-pagers that are really, I think, very, very useful for parents. Now, another thing for parents is, and I'm sure Karen has referred to this, is understood.org. That Understood is an organization actually comprised of like 18 advocacy organizations that have banded together and made a website. There's a lot of really good information on there. Actually, I'm a senior advisor for the Progress Center. One of the other senior advisors is from understood.org. So that's very good. But there's also sites like Easy CBM, Intervention Central, that have really good information on graphing, on writing goals that you can access too. And again, free information in most part. Now, like Intervention Central and Easy CBM, I mean, they do have paid components, but you can find a lot of good free stuff on there too. But everything that the U.S. Department of Education does, which includes all of PTI's Parent Training and Information Resource Institutes, all that information is free.
Okay. Should you be made to change a goal for a transition meeting, for example, from middle to high school, to make it more appropriate for high school? Or should the goal that was written at an annual stay through the life of the IEP?
No, I think you always have to assess a child's needs in writing goals, and with transition goals, it's no different than any other type of goal. If that goal is no longer appropriate or they need another goal, yeah, absolutely. So you should be writing goals, or writing a new goal, I should say.
What if a child isn't making progress, but the school doesn't want to talk programming?
Well, if a child is not making progress, first thing, of course, you need to have real measures of progress to see, and oftentimes schools don't have those. But it's well within a parent's right to insist. I mean, one of the things that I talked about, understood.org, they published something that they used to have on the website, I think they still do, called the Andrew Toolkit. And it was essentially a kit for parents to bring into IEP meetings to tell them what is appropriate here? And they would address issues like that. Well, what if the school says no, something about progress that's incorrect? The toolkit would have a quotation from the Andrew and tell you exactly what that meant. So again, one of those free resources that I think are really useful to parents and teachers alike.
How would you collaborate with a parent who wants goals that are not appropriate for a student's present levels? For example, a fourth grade student in a centralized classroom for students with significant functional communication deficits, currently working on WH questions with a kinder reading level. Parent wants IEP goals to be written on grade level skills.
Well, kind of the most important thing there is to understand that the parent has to be meaningfully involved. And so you would discuss those things as team members. You could say, well, no, we do not believe that is appropriate given the child's current levels of skills, and we need to be working on these sorts of issues. Now, understand that, I mean, you don't have to agree on everything. You have to discuss them. And if you don't agree, the bottom line is, what does the child need? And that's your obligation as a school district. And, I've been on many IEP meetings myself when I was a teacher in which parents asked for things that I didn't think were in the best interest of the child. And that's okay to say no. We don't agree with that, but you have to say why. You have to discuss those issues. And then if you do disagree, you have to understand that, well, there are these procedural safeguards available to the parents that they may exercise.
I think if I can just add on to what Dr. Yell said, one of the things is, I think that we don't do a good job as somebody that had a child with an IEP of telling the parent the probability of the outcome. And I think teachers are for kids and they love kids and they want them to win. Even when they're writing present levels, they just don't want to write anything negative. And I always say it's data it's not good data, bad data. It's just data, right? And I don't think that we soberly tell parents what, based on the student's unique circumstances, what the probability is for gainful employment, independent living, and further education early enough. And I think that sets up parents for having, hope deferred, as it were. And we have to do a better job of talking about, what do we think the outcomes are going to be? I have 3-year-olds that have vocational goals because I know that's what we need to start working on. And we got to do a better job of talking about that, because I will have parents who are chasing Orton Gillingham, they're chasing PRI, they're chasing, OG, or just some reading program. And the truth is, we haven't sat down soberly and said, it's unlikely that your child is going to attend a 4-year college. I mean, I know Dr. Yell sees cases like this. I will have children that have an identified intellectual disability, and their transition supplement talks about them being an architect, a dentist, or an engineer, because that's what he wanted to write down. And we have to do a better job. I've had clients that have had a high schooler and their child doesn't speak, and nobody told them their child is probably unlikely to use verbal language to communicate. And we just have to do a better job at telling them that. I always say that, often special ed is a death with no funeral, right? And we have to give people a chance to grieve that, but then let's get up and write an IEP that enables them to make progress in light of their unique circumstances. And so we got to do a better job of saying that. I mean, you guys know me, I'm all about pruning an IEP. We don't need 42 goals. I want the teacher to teach. I do not want her to walk around all day with a clipboard. That doesn't benefit anybody.
Why is the Department of Education not providing more robust staff training in writing IEPs and progress reports?
Well, I think that really is, I mean, the federal government, I think, is doing as much as they can in terms of like the Progress Center. I mean, they're funding these large centers to provide assistance to the states. Well, a lot of States don't avail themselves of the resources they have, and it's really a state responsibility to train people in the LEAs or the school districts. And the school districts also get money for teacher preparation and teacher education. And so it's their responsibility too. So if it's not happening, I think the breakdown is oftentimes at the state educational agency level or the local educational agency in terms of training. I mean, is there any one profession that I think is less uses less does a poorer job of training? I mean, when you think about most professions, there's a training requirement, and I think as teachers, it would make our jobs a lot easier if we're trained fairly frequently on things like we're talking about today about writing measurable goals, or we're going to be talking about the future, collecting progress monitoring data. But it takes preparation to do that. People just don't know how to do it on their own. They need good preparation programs, good in-service programs.
Could you possibly talk about and give examples of some measurable behavior and social emotional goals?
Okay, that's a little more difficult. It's easy to write measurable goals in academics. I mean, we have tons of information on writing goals in math and writing goals in reading and writing. There's less information on writing goals in behavior, and it's very individualized. So it's kind of difficult to, I mean, you can still use that 3-step method, but it's a little more difficult. Now, there are a number of OSEP-funded centers that address those issues beside the Progress Center. I mean, the Center for Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports, you'd find good information there. But again, behaviors are different because, we don't have a way of measuring. Like, if you want to, it's very easy to measure if a child is becoming a better reader by taking oral reading fluency measures. It's less so. Behaviors are very individualized. So I would say number one is you can still use that 3-step method, but you have to do it a little differently. What's very important with behavior is we don't want to make it too difficult. We want to make it as easy as we can. The more difficult goals are, the less likely they are to be measured. So I know I'm sure a lot of you teachers out there have learned about partial interval schedules and measures and things of that momentary time sampling. I mean, that's not going to be done in a public school, so I'm not sure why we spend so much training time on it in pre-service programs, but we have to be able to find ways to measure behavior in a simplified fashion. And I would advise you, take a look at the Progress Center, look at the Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, and in fact, the National Center on Intensive Intervention has a really good booklet, free. Just go online and download it, on writing measurable behavioral and functional goals.
Okay. How can oral reading fluency, 1 to 3 minutes, provide insight into how well dyslexic high school students can read all day long, or how fluently they can learn new academic vocabulary? An isolated oral reading fluency test is different from reading something like their physics textbook. How can we measure their endurance in reading for 7 hours at school? And how can we measure the fatigue that dyslexic high school students suffer through?
Yeah, that's a problem. Actually, measuring high school students has been a problem because I've been talking about the oral reading fluency, writing fluency. Most of those are really researched on elementary students, and there's just less information on high school students, although we're getting more of it all the time. There are people that are doing really good work with high school students, but we just don't have as much information yet. And that's exactly what you're really getting at in that question. Is oral reading fluency is really for students 8th grade and under. There's not a lot of good research on older students. I mean, we know a lot about teaching adults to read. We don't know as much about measuring progress.
Okay. Oral reading fluency, my kiddos start at 0 words per minute. What's the expectation for growth? Is it kid dependent?
Well, I didn't quite hear that.
For oral reading fluency, my kiddos start at 0 words per minute. What's the expectation for growth, or is it kid dependent?
Well, it is kid dependent. I mean, individualization is the kind of the watchword of really IDEA and IEPs. If the child reads no words per minute, what a teacher should do is use a different type of measurement. Instead of oral reading fluency, say if they're working on alphabet, you'd use random alphabet numbers. So all that kind of information you could find on Intervention Central or Easy CBM. You have to choose the type of measurement tool that is the most appropriate for the child. But we know this, if you choose a measurement tool that is a little above the child, it's actually better in terms of measuring growth. But if you choose something like your child doesn't read any words per minute, that wouldn't be an appropriate measure there. Yeah.
Okay, how do teachers assess a nonverbal student with an AAC device when the teacher is not sure and that this test, and it says M class, is not going to show what he knows and he can have accommodations or not?
Well, I would say that's clearly that's a pretty difficult question. But if a child is the important thing is to find out what you can measure and then measure it. I mean, in the example you give, and maybe you want to talk about this too, Karen, it seems that, and in the last one too, the types of measures chosen were just not appropriate given the child's level of needs. So then it would be a matter of finding expertise in that area and looking at what do they use for monitoring progress, for measuring where the child is, for collecting baseline data.
Right, and I'll speak to that just a little bit. Last week we had Dr. Deanna Linick on, and her specialty in AAC and voice output communication device will be up on our YouTube channel, Special Education Academy. The average person speaks 150 words per minute. You can usually relate what they speak often to their words correct per minute. I'm sure I speak much more than that. Somebody that uses technology on a symbol system is at 1/10 of that, 1/10. So a student who's young is using it 9 to 12 words a minute. And so one of the things that I think is hard for us to do in special education is to slow down and wait. I know none of us like to wait. We will sit in the drive-thru. We won't get out of our cars. And if we don't wait and measure that which is within their prosody, their cadence, how they produce something, then we're just disadvantaging them. So if you go back in Special Education Academy, it's been a couple years. I think we're gonna have him back on. There was a young man on who has his master's that is nonverbal, that has a website called Lessons from the Big Toe. And he literally speaks with his one toe on a device. And even while I was doing the interview, it was very hard for me to wait for him to respond, And so we have to measure, is it sign language? Is it symbol system? Is there literacy through Braille? What is their measurement and what is the specificity about that? But certainly reach out to Dr. Olenek, and on the website, she is the best. She's an expert witness for the Department of Justice as it relates to communication. But right, we don't measure a nonverbal child oral reading fluency. We talk about, what can they indicate? What can we measure to look at expectation, rate of progress and growth, and then how can we build on that?
When a student uses a device or an interpreter, do you change the goal to include that?
So I'm certainly going to put what I need in that goal to look at progress, right? And so if that is, if both of those are AAC, both of those are alternative or augmentative communication. They're both literally symbol systems. So kind of when Dr. Yell was talking about a need and then a service, I would have that service professional attached to a goal that could measure that, whether that was reading or something like that.
As an art facilitator, I know a lot of meetings come down on me. Should I be checking my case manager's goals?
So ARD, a lovely acronym in Texas, I think it's a great acronym. Admission, review, and dismissal, which is what you're doing at any point in an IEP meeting. I think that, in Texas, we did this pivot where we had diagnosticians leading IEP meetings, which is not what diagnosticians wanted to do. And then we've switched to ARD facilitators. I think that the goal writing, ultimately, in my opinion, should be overseen by the case manager. This case manager is a special educator. IEP leads or even IEP facilitators or ARD facilitators often aren't special education teachers, and they are trying to gather and facilitate meetings where I believe the case manager should be overseeing the dissemination, the implementation, and the construction of the IEP. But I'll let Dr. Yell speak to that.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. I mean, I think it's important now. I know most states, an LEA representative often leads an IEP meeting, and the case manager is usually the one who's responsible for determining, writing the goals, or helping to develop the goals to actually measure the goals. But the LEA rep still does have a responsibility to make certain that one, the IEP is actually accurate in terms of the substance of it. That is what Andrew, the Supreme Court called, a substantive standard, that the goals are actually measured, are actually measurable, and they're actually measured. It's also up to I don't know if it'd be the ARD in your state. Most states, the LEA is also responsible for implementation. So supervision is clearly an important thing to do, but it should be the case manager or the actual teacher that is helping is collecting the data. We just need to make sure that the data is being collected and decisions are made upon the data.
Can a goal be rewritten, modified, adjusted without an additional IEP meeting as long as there is written parental consent and agreement with the IEP team?
Well, what you essentially, in 2004, Congress gave us the option of the teacher getting together with a parent, rewriting goals, actually quite a bit of power in that way without holding another IEP meeting. Now, you would have to amend the IEP if you make changes to it, and it would take, you would have to have permission of the IEP team to do that, but you wouldn't have to have a meeting.
Okay.
As long as the parent, I should say, was in agreement.
Okay. Parents would like to rewrite goals because the school insists the child is making progress on their goals, but they are failing classes. How can we merge progress on goals and success in the classroom?
Well, I would say in terms of, there's often, usually I hear the opposite. It's school districts saying, boy, kiddo is just doing fine in school. He doesn't need any goals. He's passing his grades. I tend not to hear it the other way around, but I would say it's very important that obviously they pass goals or pass their classes, but that is really more in the supplementary aids and services and the program modifications, so or accommodations to help them in the class. It's not so much the goals. You don't write goals for social studies class, for example, but you could certainly write a program modification in a social studies class.
Yeah, we would love to hear that.
Dr. Yell, do you have an anticipated publication date for the 6th edition of Law in Special Education?
No, I'm just writing it now, making fairly significant changes to it. There is actually a much cheaper book too. Right back here, the Writing Educational, Meaningful, Legally Correct IEPs. That is not as all encompassing. It's just about the IEP. That's by a company called Roman Littlefield. That just came out. So that actually a lot of things we were talking about. In fact, in Mager's 3-step method, I introduced that in one of the chapters of that.
And that book with the amazing little light bulb is in our link too. It's in our Amazon bookstore, so certainly go and get that.
But the other one's going to take a while. The publishing is not a quick and easy procedure.
It is not a drive-through.
No, it's not a drive-through. Takes a year at least to write it, and then they have to print it and edit it and all that good stuff. So,
okay. Karen, I'm interested in becoming an advocate. Can you share how to get started?
I can. So we have, of course, we do social media on all platforms, but we have the Academy, Special Education Academy, which is every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Central, where we talk about legal requirements under the federal law, applications of the law, and your duties, responsibilities. And then also we have a 2-day intensive, which you can take on demand. We have one coming up in February. It'll be the only virtual live one in February, the 24th and 25th. And so certainly you can log on from your balcony, your boat, or your bathtub. If you're in your bathtub, just keep your camera off. So we certainly equip people for everyone that sits at the 504 IEP table. There's 7.5 million children in America that have an IEP. Those families and parents need guidance, recommendations, and support as they walk through the special ed process. And so we're taking 2 more questions, Dr. Taylor. I know we have a million more, but if you can give us 2 more questions, that would be great.
Okay, Texas has recently updated law related to dyslexia and dyslexia intervention. It's now considered specially designed instruction. Do you believe that teachers should be required to have special education certification if they are the service provider? And does certification mean that they must be a case manager?
did you want to answer that, Karen?
Well, welcome to Texas. So here's what's good and not good. This could be its own seminar. Much of the statute got what we call chopped up on the floor. And when something goes between becoming a legal thing, and these are just Karen words, there's a lot of give and take. And I think the intention of the law was great. But as I sit in meetings, there are 4 options, delivery model A, B, C, and D. A and B don't include a special ed teacher. So I literally had a school district, I won't tell you which one, say our school district is choosing type A for every student. So unfortunately, that's going to have to be litigated in Texas because, as I understand IDEA, if it's under the SPED umbrella, it's under the SPED umbrella. You hooching it around and saying it's SPED, but general ed is not going to pass the sniff test. Short version, if I had to file on that, I would file OCR. OCR looks at federal requirements, not state requirements. I don't think it's going to have a lot of, if you wanted to file on that in a state issue, there is right now, I can't remember her name, but somebody from the state that is sort of answering questions about the dyslexia handbook and the implementation. is going around in areas and speaking to that. I know that a young lady will be here in the Woodlands in Texas, Wednesday, February 7th. Unfortunately, we don't have the new printed updates. Every time you give more law and more directions and more Q&A, it just causes more confusion. And so for me, if it's under the SPED umbrella, conversation's over. But I'm sure, I don't know that Dr. Yell is familiar with that, but I think the intention was good, but it's still the same general ed, special ed providers.
And we actually have the same thing in special ed in South Carolina, that we have a dyslexia bill also. It doesn't sound similar to yours, but what it does do is say all teachers have to be trained in dyslexia. And like with many laws, there are unintended things that happened, like teachers of youngsters with severe handicaps that have no communication ability are having to learn how to teach dyslexics. Well, is that what they intended? No, probably not. And in the end result is essentially our legislature has decided to get into education, which is never really a good thing, I don't think. But they've really come down on our general education system in our state because they say, why aren't you teaching teachers how to teach reading, for example?
Yeah.
And the final question is, this was a lot of information to digest. Will this recording be available afterwards or sent out to us?
So it's going to be sent out to you, and then it's going to be available forever on the great YouTube. So Dr. Yell is very generous to share his time with us. We greatly appreciate it, and we want you to have the information. I know what Dr. Yell wants and what I want is for everybody to be equipped so that they can be better stakeholders at the IEP meeting, make better decisions, and serve children better, right? My mission statement is, when we get it right for the child, we get it right for everybody. And I see this is probably the worst area that we do. It doesn't change teachers' hearts, but we have to write goals that change outcomes for the student. And so I think often we have goals that are just either crazy busy or they just check a box. And so Dr. Yell, again, we can't thank you enough for your time. We're going to be here in February talking about collecting data, my favorite 4-letter word. We had a question the other night, Dr. Yell, and the question was, if the data says this, is there something else we should look at? It's the only thing we look at is data. Yeah. So we are super excited about that. So thank you for coming.
Well, thanks for asking.
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to capture all of your questions. The 4 of us will stay on and do that in a fancy way. But remember, when we get it right for the child, we get it right for everybody. And we'll see you guys in the next training.